The Night Ferry St. Helier cut through the ink-black waters of the English Channel with steady indifference, its iron hull humming like a restrained beast. Passengers had long since retired to their cabins, lulled by the rhythm of engines and tide. Only the sea remained awake, whispering along the portholes in restless sighs. At precisely 12 minutes past 1 in the morning, a scream shattered the quiet. It came from cabin 17, an inside cabin on the lower deck, narrow as a coffin and just as airless. By the time the ship's purser, Mr. Collingwood, forced the door open with the master key, 3 passengers had gathered behind him in various states of alarm. What they saw within was both stark and impossible. Sir Alister Wrentham, a steel magnate of formidable reputation and even more formidable wealth, lay sprawled across the floor between the berth and the washstand. His silk dressing gown was darkened at the chest, a single precise wound over the heart. There was very little blood, too little, one might think, for such a fatal injury. His face bore an expression not of terror, but of astonishment. The cabin was locked from the inside. The small porthole was secured, latched tight against the sea spray. The wash-basin was dry. His suitcase sat unopened beneath the bunk. On the narrow table beside the bed rested a silver pocket watch, stopped at 1:07 a.m., and next to it a child's tin whistle painted a garish red. The whistle did not belong to Sir Alister. Of that much everyone was certain. Within minutes the captain was summoned. The ferry could not turn back. They were too far from Dover, and not yet near Calais. The body would remain where it lay. The cabin would be sealed, and the passengers, all 32 of them, would remain aboard until authorities met them at port. Word spread like spilled ink. Sir Alister had dined alone that evening, though he had been seen in animated conversation earlier in the lounge. He was not a well-loved man. His business practices were described as ruthless. He had recently concluded a legal dispute with a former partner. He was, as one steward muttered, a man with a long shadow. Yet shadows did not pass through locked doors. The key was found on the inside of the cabin, still in the lock. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no weapon, but the whistle. It lay there with mocking innocence, a thing one might win at a seaside fair. When the purser picked it up and blew, it produced a shrill, almost petulant note that made several passengers flinch. "Perhaps a child has lost it," someone suggested weakly. There were no children aboard. A search of Sir Alister's person revealed nothing beyond his wallet, a gold fountain pen, and a folded telegram in his breast pocket. The telegram read only, "It is not finished. You are the last passenger." The message was unsigned. The captain examined the porthole himself. Even had it been opened, no grown man could have passed through. And yet, the wound in Sir Alister's chest was clean, almost surgical. Not a slash. A thrust. A murder committed in a locked cabin in the middle of the sea. By 2 in the morning, panic had begun its quiet work. Conversations hushed as others approached. Accusations lingered unspoken in glances. The ship, once a mere vessel, had become an island of suspicion. One passenger in particular had not yet emerged from his cabin. He had boarded at the last moment in Dover, carrying only a modest valise and wearing a coat of impeccable tailoring. His moustaches were the subject of brief but sincere admiration among the stewards. When at last the captain knocked upon cabin 5, the door opened promptly. Hercule Poirot regarded him with mild curiosity. "Yes, Captain? There has been an incident." Poirot's eyes sharpened, though his posture remained serene. "Ah," he said softly. "Then the sea, it seems, is not the only thing restless tonight." He listened without interruption as the captain described the scene: the locked door, the wound, the whistle, the telegram. When the account was finished, Poirot requested only one thing: "Take me to the cabin." They descended together into the narrow corridor where the air seemed already heavier. Cabin 17 awaited, sealed but not silent. The body remained as it had fallen. The stopped watch lay beside the absurd whistle. Poirot stepped inside and surveyed the small room without touching a thing. His gaze lingered on the porthole, the bed, the carpet, the telegram now laid upon the washstand. Finally, he bent not to examine the wound, nor the watch, but the floor just inside the door. There, faint but undeniable, was a thin crescent of dampness, not sea water, something darker, something that had already begun to dry. Poirot straightened slowly. "A locked room," he murmured. "A dead man who is the last passenger, and a whistle that cries like a child." He glanced toward the corridor, where anxious faces hovered. "No, no," he said quietly. "This crime is not impossible. It is merely arranged." Outside, the ferry continued its steady course through the night, carrying among its passengers a murderer who, for the moment, believed himself as secure as a locked door in the middle of the sea. The passengers withdrew slightly as Poirot stepped into the corridor again, as though proximity to him might reveal their thoughts. He seemed not to notice them. Instead, he stood very still, listening not to their whispers, but to the ship itself. The engines throbbed, the deck creaked. Somewhere above, a door closed. Time, like the ferry, moved steadily forward. "Captain," he said at last, "I will speak with the passengers, one by one. But first, you will tell me who discovered the body." "Miss Elaine Harper," the captain replied, gesturing to a pale young woman clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "She occupies the adjoining cabin." Poirot approached her with gentle courtesy. "Mademoiselle, you were awake at this late hour. Why?" Her fingers tightened in the wool. "I am a poor sleeper. The sea makes me restless. I heard something. A sound, the scream, number. Before that, a thin sound, like a toy." Her eyes moved involuntarily toward the sealed cabin. A whistle. A murmur stirred among the listeners. Poirot inclined his head. "At what time, if you please?" "I do not know exactly. Perhaps just after 1. Then silence. Then, some minutes later, the scream. It was I who screamed." "And you heard no footsteps? No door opening?"
"No, monsieur."
Poirot studied her face. There was fear, yes, but also confusion. Genuine, he thought. Yet something in her account interested him more than the rest. "The whistle," he repeated softly. He turned next to the purser. "You examined the corridor?" "Yes. No one was there." No one could have passed without being seen. The night steward was at the end of the passage. The steward, a narrow-faced man with anxious eyes, stepped forward. "I saw nothing, sir. I swear it." No one came out of that cabin. Poirot nodded but asked nothing further. Instead, he walked the length of the corridor himself. The carpet was thick, patterned in dark blues and greens. It would easily muffle steps. He paused beneath a small electric lamp and crouched slightly, examining the fabric. "Captain," he said, "when was this carpet last cleaned?" The captain blinked. "Yesterday morning, I believe." "Bon. And yet—" Poirot brushed the surface lightly with his fingertips. A faint residue marked them, barely visible. He stood and glanced toward the steward. "You wear soft-soled shoes, yes?" "Yes, sir." "And the passengers, mostly?" Poirot's gaze drifted to the row of cabin doors. "It is curious. No one sees, no one hears. And yet a man dies." He returned toward cabin 17 but stopped just short of the sealed door. His attention had fixed upon something small and easily overlooked. The brass number plate. He leaned closer. The screws holding it in place were not equally worn. One was bright. "Recently turned." "Captain," Poirot said quietly, "has this plate been removed?" "Number. Why would it?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he pressed the edge of the plate very slightly. It shifted just enough. Behind him, someone drew a sharp breath, but he did not remove it. Not yet. Instead, he turned suddenly to the assembled passengers. "Messieurs et messieurs, you will forgive me, but I must ask. Who among you knew Sir Alistair Wrentham?" Several hands rose hesitantly. A stout gentleman with a red face spoke first. "We met only on board. Business acquaintance, nothing more." A thin woman in mourning black said coldly, "I knew him. My brother worked for him. Ruined by him." A young man with nervous energy added, "I had an appointment with him in Calais." Investment. Poirot watched them all, but it was not their words that interested him. It was the reactions of the others. One man, standing near the rear, had not raised his hand. Tall, composed, with iron-grey hair. Yet at the mention of the whistle he had flinched. Only slightly. Only for a second. Now, as the questioning continued, his gaze remained fixed not on Poirot, not on the captain, but on the sealed cabin door. Poirot moved closer to him without seeming to do so. "And you, monsieur?" he asked mildly. "You did not know the victim?" The man hesitated. "Number," His voice was controlled, too controlled. But you heard nothing in the night? Number. Poirot's eyes rested on his hands. The fingers were steady, yet one cuff was damp, not with seawater. The same dark crescent he had seen inside the cabin. Poirot smiled faintly, though the smile did not reach his eyes. "Ah," he murmured. "Already the little deceptions begin." He turned away as though satisfied, but his mind had begun to assemble the first fragile structure of truth. The whistle, the telegram, the dampness, the loosened plate. The murderer had not left the cabin, but neither had he entered it in the way everyone believed. And somewhere on this ferry, someone was waiting not merely for escape, but for something else, something unfinished. The sea outside whispered against the hull, patient as time itself, while Poirot prepared to listen more closely than any of them imagined. Poirot allowed the small gathering to disperse only a little before he began, for he preferred that tension should remain in the air. It sharpened the mind and loosened the tongue. The captain arranged a quiet corner of the lounge, though the steady vibration of the engines seemed louder here, as if reminding them all that there was no escape from the ship or from the truth. He invited the stout gentleman first. The man introduced himself as Mr. Frederick Barstow, a manufacturer from Birmingham. He wiped his forehead repeatedly with a handkerchief that was already damp. "You say you met Sir Alister only on board?" Poirot said gently. Yes, purely by chance. We spoke of tariffs, trade routes, nothing more. At what hour did you retire? Shortly after midnight. I had brandy with him, in fact. He was in good spirits, quite jovial. Poirot tilted his head. Jovial? This surprises me. Others describe him as a man of severity. Barstow hesitated. Well, perhaps not jovial, but not troubled, certainly not afraid. And yet he received a telegram warning him. Barstow blinked. Telegram? I knew nothing of that. Poirot watched him closely. The reaction seemed genuine, but there was relief there as well, relief at being ignorant. The man was afraid of something, but not of murder, of involvement. When he left, the woman in mourning took his place. She gave her name as Mrs. Lydia Cresswell. Her gaze was direct, almost defiant. You hated him, Poirot said quietly. Yes, you wished him dead. Her lips tightened. Often, and tonight. I spoke to him in the lounge. I told him he would one day answer for what he had done. Strong words. I meant them. And after this, I returned to my cabin. I heard nothing. I slept. Poirot let the silence stretch. Mademoiselle Harper heard the whistle. I did not, but your cabin is nearer. The faintest flicker crossed her eyes. I sleep heavily. Poirot inclined his head. Bien sûr. She left with controlled dignity, yet her hands trembled as she passed the corridor. Next came the young man, Adrian Locke. He sat forward eagerly. I had business with Sir Alister. He was to finance a venture shipping machinery to the continent. He agreed in principle this evening. At what time did you part? Just before midnight. And afterward? I walked the deck. I could not sleep. The air was cold but bracing. Did you see anyone? Number. The deck was empty. Poirot leaned forward slightly. No one. Locke swallowed. Well, I did see a man near the stern, but I did not recognize him. It was dark. Describe him. Tall, coat collar up. Poirot nodded, though his eyes had sharpened. And you did not think this important? Two did not know there had been a murder. When he departed, the steward was called again. This time Poirot's questions were more precise. You remained at the end of the corridor? Yes, sir. For the entire hour. Yes. No one passed you. Number. Poirot smiled faintly. You are certain? The steward hesitated. There was a moment. I went to fetch towels. Only for a minute. The man flushed. But no one could have a minute is a long time, my friend. The steward looked stricken. Finally, Poirot asked that the tall, grey-haired man be brought. He entered calmly, his composure almost impressive.
My name is Charles Denham, he said.
You travel alone?
Yes.
Your destination? Paris. You heard nothing in the night? Number. Poirot regarded him. And yet, monsieur, you were awake. Denham's eyes narrowed. What makes you say that? The dampness upon your cuff, recently washed. Why? Denham did not answer at once. The silence grew heavy. At sea, he said at last, one may spill wine. Indeed, and if I had heard something, what then? There was no reason to interfere. No reason? Poirot repeated softly. Denham met his gaze. I do not involve myself in the affairs of strangers. Poirot leaned back. And Sir Alister was a stranger? Yes, but there was a fraction too much force in the word. As Denham rose to leave, Poirot spoke again, almost idly. Tell me, monsieur, do you play the whistle? Denham froze. Only for an instant. Then he smiled. Number. When he had gone, Poirot remained seated, fingertips together, eyes half closed. Each voice had told a story. None had told the truth. Too much cooperation, too much silence, too much fear. Hatred, money, warning, secrecy. And above all, the sense that Sir Alister had not been merely a victim. He had been waiting. Poirot opened his eyes. The murderer, he murmured to the empty lounge, is not the only one who deceives. This ship carries many secrets, but only one of them killed. Poirot rose from the lounge chair, his gaze sweeping the corridor and the now quiet deck beyond the windows. He walked slowly, deliberately, the soft soles of his shoes barely making a sound, as though even the ferry itself had conspired to hide its secrets. The passengers had returned to their cabins, but the atmosphere was charged with invisible currents, each individual a node in a web that he alone could begin to unravel. He first considered Mr. Barstow, the stout manufacturer. On the surface, a chance acquaintance, a business-minded traveller, eager to appear blameless. But Poirot recalled the flicker of nervousness in Barstow's eyes, the way he had tensed when the telegram was mentioned. Greed, perhaps not for wealth, but for opportunity. A man who felt he had been denied something, who might strike if he believed the reward was worth the risk. Yet there was nothing directly linking him to the cabin, nothing except proximity in time and place. Mrs. Cresswell, with her mourning clothes and rigid posture, was another story. Hatred was too strong a motive to ignore. Her brother had been ruined, and she had declared it openly. But hatred alone did not account for the precision of the murder, nor for the mysterious whistle and the locked door. Could a crime so neat be committed in a sudden fit of rage? Poirot shook his head. Number, hatred could provide motive, but not method. Adrian Locke, the young investor, seemed eager, almost naive. He had ambition, a desire to involve himself in Sir Alister's ventures. Perhaps he feared rejection or humiliation. Poirot recalled the tall shadow he had glimpsed on the deck, which Locke claimed to have seen but not recognized. A man who watches, then hides himself, yet is noted by those who remain alert. This suggested a different layer to the story. Someone skilled at observation, someone who could strike without leaving a trace. And then there was Charles Denham, the tall, composed man whose damp cough and momentary flinch betrayed more than his words admitted. He had insisted he did not involve himself in strangers' affairs, yet even in that statement, there was tension, an underlying insistence on control. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But fear of what, and guilt over what? The whistle question, he had flinched. Only someone intimately familiar with it could have reacted that way. Poirot began to map the connections in his mind, a delicate lattice of human motives: greed, jealousy, revenge, fear. Each suspect had a thread, each a possible reason to commit the crime, yet no single explanation tied them all together. The telegram, cryptic and threatening, suggested premeditation and a personal stake in Sir Alister's death. But whose stake? Whose advantage? The pieces did not yet form a coherent pattern. He returned to the cabin, walking slowly along the corridor, eyes lingering on the carpet, the brass number plate, and the slight damp mark. The logical possibilities multiplied. If Barstow was motivated by ambition or opportunity, could he have arranged the scene without leaving a trace? If Mrs. Cresswell acted out of vengeance, how did she circumvent the locked door and porthole? If Locke was involved at all, why only a shadow on the deck rather than the murder itself? And Denham, his calm composure, was a mask, one that concealed something far deeper. Poirot could feel it in the subtle contradictions, the damp cough, the flinch, the insistence on innocence. He thought of the whistle again, small and absurd, yet pivotal. A child's toy, it seemed, but it had elicited reactions, had caused involuntary movements in those who had known, or recognized, its significance. The telegram called Sir Alister the last passenger. The phrase lingered in Poirot's mind. last implying a sequence, a hierarchy, a message only the intended recipient could fully understand. Someone had orchestrated the murder with both theatricality and precision, using fear as well as planning. Poirot moved to the window, looking out at the restless water. The sea had not yielded its secrets, but within the ship a pattern was emerging, however faint. Each suspect's motive was clear in part, yet the true method remained hidden, the connection between intent and action still blurred. He could sense the threads beginning to converge, greed, vengeance, ambition, fear, all tangled, overlapping, yet pointing toward a single hidden orchestrator. His little grey cells worked quietly, methodically, weaving the human impulses into a map of possibilities. Soon, he knew, the first invisible strand would snap, revealing a truth so carefully concealed that only someone like him, who observed both the obvious and the overlooked, could discern it. And when that thread revealed itself, the rest would follow, unmasking a killer whose cunning had so far seemed untouchable. For now, the passengers remained unaware that the detective had already begun to trace the motive maze with precision, and that the night, long and watchful, would not hide the truth for much longer. Poirot lingered near the cabin door, his eyes tracing the faint crescent of dampness on the carpet once more. He crouched briefly, examining the brass number plate again, then straightened with a small, almost imperceptible nod. His mind had begun assembling the sequence, step by step, but the solution was still not complete. Yet outside the cabin, excitement was beginning to swell. The captain and purser had discovered something they deemed definitive. The lock itself had a flaw. One of the screws on the number plate had been tampered with, allowing a tiny gap just wide enough for a slender object to pass through a key, or perhaps a tool. The implication seemed obvious, almost too easy. The authorities, having been contacted by radio, arrived with efficient haste. Their chief investigator, Inspector Langford, wasted no time. Within an hour, after a cursory examination and a series of pointed questions, he announced the breakthrough. The cabin had been accessed through the manipulated plate. The murder weapon must have been slipped through this opening, striking the victim with shocking precision. He pointed to the whistle, which had been found on the bedside table. "It's a signal," Langford declared, "a marker left by the killer." The implication was that the culprit had orchestrated everything to create an illusion of the impossible, only to leave a telltale sign. The passengers, exhausted and anxious, seemed relieved. One by one, murmurs of praise reached Poirot's ears. At last, they had someone to blame a solution. Inspector Langford, satisfied with the apparent clarity, began organizing the gathering of statements, congratulating himself on a case seemingly solved. The ferry staff nodded and whispered among themselves, and even the more reserved passengers allowed themselves tentative smiles. The tension that had weighed on the ship for hours appeared, for the first time, to lift. Poirot, however, did not move to join in the celebration. He remained near the cabin door, observing, listening, thinking. Something in the arrangement of evidence struck him as staged, too neat. The tampered plate, the whistle, the subtle yet theatrical, everything pointed not to a clumsy mistake, but to deliberate deception. Inspector Langford's solution, while superficially plausible, failed to account for several critical details. The damp mark inside the cabin, the precise location of the wound, the victim's expression of astonishment, these were anomalies that no simple tampered screw could explain. Poirot's little grey cells hummed, attuned to the subtleties that others missed. He recalled the reactions of the passengers, each subtly revealing their own knowledge or fears. Denham's flinch at the whistle, Mrs. Cresswell's controlled tremor, Barstow's relief at the telegram's mention, Locke's shadow on the deck. None of these threads aligned with Langford's neat conclusion. The authorities had chosen the easiest narrative, the one that required minimal imagination and offered immediate closure, but Poirot knew that in cases of human cunning, the simplest answer was often a trap. Stepping back, he surveyed the cabin one last time before returning to the lounge. The passengers were already whispering about the so-called solution, but he ignored them. The real killer remained on board, invisible in plain sight, perhaps even watching the collective relief. Poirot felt the presence of that silent predator like a chill wind along the corridor. The murderer was patient, calculating, and confident that the investigators were misled. As the ferry continued its relentless course toward Calais, Poirot considered his next steps. He needed to probe further, to apply scrutiny where others accepted appearances. The false victory could lull everyone into complacency, but for him it was merely another layer of the puzzle. Somewhere among the passengers, the orchestrator of the night's horrors remained poised, waiting for the precise moment when fear and opportunity intersected. Poirot's task was clear: unmask the truth before the night's final act unfolded. The real solution, he knew, was not in the tampered plate or the whistle, but in understanding the mind that had conceived the crime and in exposing it, no matter how deeply it hid, among the innocent and the guilty alike. Poirot remained in the lounge long after the false victory had been celebrated, quietly observing the passengers as they retreated into uneasy sleep or whispered conjecture. The hum of the engines and the slap of the waves against the hull seemed louder now, as though the sea itself were impatient for the truth to emerge. He sipped a small cup of coffee and let his mind drift backward through the years, to cases that had seemed straightforward but revealed hidden roots when least expected. Often, he thought, the present crime was merely the final act of a drama begun long ago. His eyes fell again upon Charles Denham. The man's poise, his calm, the subtle tremor when the whistle had been mentioned, there was something more there than immediate motive. Poirot's memory stirred. Denham's name reminded him faintly of a legal dispute years prior, a case involving Sir Alister Wrentham and a young lawyer's firm in London. A minor case at the time, a breach of contract that had seemed unremarkable except that it had ruined the careers of two associates. Poirot had never investigated it personally, but he had read the reports. The case concluded quietly, with settlements and resignations, and the world had moved on, except some never forget, and some never forgive. Poirot leaned back, considering the other passengers in this new light. Mrs. Lydia Cresswell, so obviously bitter towards Sir Alister for her brother, might have been involved, but only partially. Barstow, eager and attentive, perhaps had financial grievances, but his actions seemed constrained by fear. Adrian Locke's ambition appeared naive, yet he had witnessed something, or perhaps been manipulated. Each passenger, Poirot realized, was not isolated. Their motives, their resentments, their fears intersected with the past in unexpected ways. The crime was not simply the result of a quarrel at sea, it was a culmination of old grievances, buried but not forgotten. He recalled the telegram again. "It is not finished. You are the last passenger." The phrasing was deliberate. Someone had framed this murder as the conclusion of an unfinished business, and the words themselves hinted that the recipient, Sir Alister, had wronged the sender long ago. But which of the passengers could link to an old case or long-standing resentment? And how had they orchestrated the night so flawlessly, leaving only minor traces, the whistle, the damp mark, the slightly loosened plate, to confuse any observer? Poirot's mind traced through each encounter, each contradiction, each flinch. The puzzle pieces began to show faint but meaningful connections. Then he remembered something subtle from the steward's account. When he had gone to fetch towels, he had passed both Barstow and Denham in the corridor. He recalled the shadows on the deck reported by Locke. The proximity of all three during the crucial minutes suggested coordination, deliberate, quiet, and precise. And Mrs. Cresswell. She had left her cabin promptly after dinner, ostensibly to retire. But Poirot suspected her route had intersected with the others in ways unseen, perhaps serving as a distraction. The strands of the past, the ruined careers, financial losses, personal vendettas were knitting themselves into a present that seemed carefully staged to hide the real orchestrator. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment and replayed the evening in his mind, slowly and meticulously. Each passenger, each reaction, each minor discrepancy now took on new significance. A glance here, a flinch there, a faintly remembered legal dispute, a personal grudge long ignored. Together, they suggested a hidden network. Not just one killer acting alone, but a sequence of events rooted in unresolved past injustices, converging on this single night. The crime was not merely a singular act of malice, it was a culmination of long-buried resentments, carefully timed and engineered. Opening his eyes, Poirot leaned back in the chair and allowed himself a small smile, one of quiet satisfaction. The shadows of the past were beginning to reveal themselves, faint outlines of motives and connections that others had overlooked entirely. The killers had underestimated the power of memory, the persistence of grudges, and the acuity of a mind trained to see both the obvious and the overlooked. Somewhere among these passengers, the invisible hand of old vengeance had left its mark, and soon Poirot knew that hand would be forced to reveal itself. The night, still young, had many secrets yet to surrender. Poirot rose early the next morning, the ferry still cutting a steady swath through the grey waters of the Channel. He moved with deliberate calm, leaving the passengers to their uneasy rest, and made his way to the lounge where he could observe the corridors without distraction. The ordinary rhythms of the ship, the distant clatter of trays from the dining room, the soft murmur of engines, the occasional footsteps of an early riser were his allies. He had already mapped the network of motives and past grievances in his mind, but now he needed to test the invisible threads that held the web together. Logic alone would not suffice. He required a subtle, unconventional approach to prompt a truth to emerge. He considered Charles Denham, whose restrained demeanor and damp cough had already piqued his suspicion. Poirot's strategy was simple: create a scenario that would provoke an involuntary reaction, one that would betray a hidden awareness of the crime. He arranged a casual meeting in the lounge, ostensibly to discuss the details of the so-called solved investigation. Other passengers were invited, not directly, but they lingered nearby, as though drawn by curiosity. The subtle presence of witnesses would sharpen reactions, Poirot knew. He began by placing the child's red whistle on the table, ostensibly absent-minded, and recounted aloud the discovery of the telegram and the tampered brass plate. His voice was measured, conversational, with no overt judgment. Each statement was neutral, even casual, yet carefully calibrated to focus attention on elements that could unnerve someone with prior knowledge. Poirot observed the reactions of the group with an intensity that went unnoticed, like the tide, slowly shaping the sand before the wave strikes. Denham entered quietly, greeting Poirot with his usual calm, and seated himself across from the lounge table. The whistle, innocuous to anyone else, lay between them. Poirot picked it up, letting it rest lightly in his fingers, and then casually blew a faint note. The sound was high, thin, almost playful, but it carried attention all the same. Most passengers flinched slightly, but only on the man of interest showed a momentary sharp intake of breath, almost imperceptible, a micro-expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Poirot's keen eyes noted it. The reaction was immediate, reflexive, betraying recognition and anxiety in a single fleeting gesture. "Ah," Poirot said softly, with no more than a smile. "A very strange sound, is it not? One would think it belongs to a child, yet it seems to command attention among certain adults." His voice suggested curiosity, not accusation, but the effect was deliberate. He spoke as though pondering the nature of the whistle in relation to the crime, as if it might unlock an understanding that had eluded everyone. Denham's composure wavered just slightly. His hand twitched toward his coat pocket, then withdrew. Poirot's sharp gaze followed the movement. He continued, "Curious how objects left behind can convey more than mere presence. A message, perhaps, intended for someone only certain minds would interpret correctly." His eyes did not leave Denham. Sometimes the smallest detail can speak volumes when one knows how to listen. Denham forced a polite smile, but the micro-expression had betrayed him. He was aware, far more aware than the others imagined, and his carefully constructed innocence had a subtle crack. Poirot's instinct confirmed it. The man had touched, handled, or at least understood the significance of the whistle in a way no bystander would. That understanding, fleeting, involuntary, and instinctive, was the key to the next stage of the investigation. The other passengers, noticing nothing more than Poirot's attention to minor objects, continued their quiet murmuring, oblivious to the psychological test that had just been enacted. But Poirot's mind was alight. The unconventional Cluth whistle, combined with Denham's imperceptible reaction, had revealed more than any official examination or routine questioning could. It was not just evidence in the traditional sense, it was a mirror reflecting a hidden awareness, and the reflection pointed directly to the orchestration of the crime. Poirot leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the implications. The web of past grievances, intertwined motives, and careful planning was beginning to yield to subtle observation, and now, for the first time, he could see a visible thread among the shadows, leading unmistakably toward the real criminal waiting, patient, and unaware that their secret had just begun to unravel. Poirot's satisfaction, though quiet, was tempered by the knowledge that criminals of cunning do not remain idle when confronted. He returned to cabin 17 once more, walking the narrow corridor with measured steps. The damp mark on the carpet, the slightly loosened brass plate, the stopped pocket watch, and, most importantly, the red Whisleyle remained where they had been discovered. Yet even as he studied them, a faint unease stirred. Something in the arrangement felt too tidy, too deliberate. It was as if the cabin itself were a stage, designed for a spectator with a certain understanding of both drama and deception. He knelt by the washstand to glance again at the telegram. "It is not finished. You are the last passenger." Its edges were crisp, and the ink still fresh enough that it hinted at the calculated timing of its delivery. Poirot felt a chill of anticipation. The message had been intended to provoke a reaction, and it had. But before he could examine it further, the faintest sound caught his attention. A soft click outside the cabin door, followed by footsteps receding down the corridor. He rose and glanced at the key in the lock. It was still there. Returning to the lounge, he found the passengers gathered as usual, murmuring over breakfast. Denham, as always, remained composed, sipping quietly from a cup of coffee while glancing now and then toward the cabin. Poirot's mind, alert as ever, considered the subtle timing of the footsteps he had heard, the soft click, the precise movements that suggested someone else had been inside the cabin while everyone else's attention was elsewhere. It was only when the purser, Mr. Collingwood, appeared visibly flustered that the first confirmation of disruption became undeniable. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, voice taut, "the whistle, it is gone." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly, though his expression remained calm. "Gone?" he repeated softly, as though savouring the word. "Yes. I placed it back on the table after your demonstration, and now it is no longer there. We have searched everywhere, sir." The detective's mind raced. The whistle had been more than a mere object. It had been a psychological instrument, a subtle trap to provoke recognition. Its disappearance meant that the orchestrator or accomplice was now actively working to obscure evidence, to redirect the investigation. Someone had moved quickly, silently, and with forethought, confirming that the killer or killers were not content to let matters unfold at their own pace. Poirot's gaze swept the passengers subtly, noting their reactions. Barstow shifted slightly, his face flushing. Locke's eyes darted toward the cabin. Mrs. Cresswell maintained her composure, though her hands gripped the edge of the table more tightly than necessary. Denham, however, betrayed nothing. His mask remained complete, but Poirot noted an imperceptible tightening around the mouth, a fraction of hesitation in his otherwise controlled demeanor. The detective's intuition whispered that the disappearance had been timed to prevent the whistle from doing what it had just done. Reveal recognition. He said nothing, merely rising and pacing slowly in front of the window. He murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "The game becomes more intricate. The threads are being pulled from behind the curtain. The key now is to see who is pulling, and in what direction. The cabin would have to be sealed again, and the purser would be instructed to guard it closely." But Poirot understood the broader implications. This was no ordinary theft. It was a calculated move to delay discovery, to prevent the unraveling of the plan too soon. Whoever had taken the whistle was confident, resourceful, and intimately familiar with both human behavior and the layout of the ferry. As the passengers murmured among themselves, oblivious to the subtle warning in their midst, Poirot allowed a faint smile. The disappearance had, paradoxically, clarified more than it obscured. It confirmed that the killer's hand was still active, that vigilance alone would not suffice, and that the final revelation would demand ingenuity equal to that of the perpetrator. The red whistle was gone, but its echo remained in the detective's mind, a signal that the game had entered its most dangerous stage, and that patience and observation must now be matched by swift and precise action. The ferry had settled into a deceptive calm, the engine's low thrum filling the empty corridors. When the alarm came, a hurried, panicked scream from the upper deck. Poirot, already tense from the missing whistle and the growing complexity of the case, rose instantly, his movements deliberate and precise. The passengers emerged from their cabins, faces pale, some clutching shawls or morning coats, others frozen in disbelief. By the time Poirot reached the source, the scene was chaotic. Cabin 23, near the stern of the ferry, had been disturbed. The door hung ajar, a suitcase overturned, papers scattered like frightened birds across the floor. But it was the occupant's absence that chilled the air. Adrian Locke was gone. No trace of him inside the room, no sign of a struggle beyond the scattered belongings, no indication of where he might have gone. Only the faint imprint of footsteps leading toward the deck, disappearing into the gloom outside. The passengers whispered nervously, some speculating that Locke had simply wandered off in confusion, others suggesting the darker possibility that he had been taken. Poirot, however, immediately recognized the implications. Whoever had orchestrated Sir Alister's murder was not finished. The disappearance of Locke was no accident. It was a warning, a demonstration of control, and a move designed to provoke fear and hesitation among the other passengers. Poirot's eyes swept the deck. The morning fog lay thick over the water, obscuring vision and amplifying shadows. He noticed a series of footprints, small, deliberate, and partially obscured by the wet planks leading toward the stern railing. Some ended abruptly, while others continued in a pattern suggesting careful retreat. Poirot crouched, examining the impressions. They were uneven, as though the individual had tried to appear lighter than they were, careful not to leave a telltale mark. Turning to the passengers, he spoke quietly, firmly. Mess Amiss, it is now evident that the killer is not content with one act. The disappearance of Monsieur Locke is no mere accident, it is part of a plan, designed to distract, to mislead, to create panic. We must act swiftly, and with our senses fully alert. Denham, standing near the back, maintained his composed posture, though a slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his concern. Mrs. Cresswell's lips were pressed together, and Barstow's hand trembled as he clutched the edge of a chair. Even in their fear, Poirot could detect subtleties, micro-expressions, gestures and postures that spoke volumes to a trained observer. Poirot moved toward the deck, motioning for the captain to follow. The fog made visibility difficult, but the detective's attention was not on the horizon. It was on the subtle signs of movement among the passengers. He noted where the shadows fell, how the wind carried sound, and the way the footfalls of those who accompanied him differed from the natural creak of the ship. Every detail mattered. Then, from the fog, came a sound of faint scuffle, barely audible over the thrum of the engines. Poirot's sharp ears caught it immediately. He advanced carefully, each step measured, until the shape of a figure emerged partially obscured by the railing. It moved quickly, retreating into the mist. Poirot paused, eyes narrowing. The figure was deliberate, controlled, and knew the ferry as well as he did. Whoever this was, they were several steps ahead, confident that each move could unsettle him, mislead him, or delay him. He returned to the deck, calling for the passengers to remain within sight, though he knew the real action was invisible to them. The stakes had shifted. The investigation was no longer merely about solving a crime already committed. Now it was about preventing another, about predicting the movements of a mind that had already proven itself cunning, ruthless, and unafraid to strike again. The ferry, cutting through the fog and the grey morning light, seemed suddenly smaller, confined, a floating stage on which a deadly game of anticipation and deception was being played. Poirot's little grey cells worked furiously, connecting the disappearance of Locke to the previous clue, the whistle, the tampered plate, the shadows of the past, and shaping a strategy that could outmaneuver a criminal who believed themselves invisible. Somewhere among the passengers, the orchestrator of the night's terror moved freely, confident in their advantage. But Poirot, ever patient, ever observant, was closing in, step by careful step. The twist was unexpected, but the detective had learned that every unexpected turn was merely another piece of the puzzle. Waiting for the right mind to arrange it, Poirot returned to the lounge, his mind already dissecting the morning's chaos. The disappearance of Adrian Locke had rattled the passengers, yet to Poirot it was another layer of the design, not a complication without reason. He sat quietly, letting the murmurs of the room wash over him, observing the misplaced coffee cup on a side table, a handkerchief draped over the back of a chair, the subtle scuff on the carpet. These were small, almost trivial details, yet Poirot had long understood that in matters of human cunning, it is precisely the trivial that hides the truth. As he reviewed the sequence of events in his mind, a memory surfaced. Miss Elaine Harper's comment from the night before. She had mentioned hearing a thin sound, like a toy just before the scream. At the time it seemed incidental, almost whimsical, yet now, with the whistle gone and Locke vanished, it resonated differently. The sound had been more than a mere prelude to panic, it had been a signal meant to provoke recognition in someone who understood its significance. The reaction of Denham, subtle but undeniable, suddenly fit into the larger mosaic. Poirot's gaze shifted to the corridor outside the lounge. The brass number plates on each cabin door caught the light in a uniform gleam. One in particular, cabin 17, still bore the evidence of the slightly loosened screw, an earlier clue dismissed by the authorities as incidental, but combined with the whistle and the telegram, it now revealed a methodical pattern: access, psychological provocation, and the orchestration of fear. Each element, insignificant alone, formed a chain when examined together. He began to pace slowly, each step measured. The footprints on the deck from the previous night, the shadow observed by Locke, the trembling of Barstow, the composure of Denhampthy, all began to take shape as elements of the same carefully arranged design. The killer had understood human behavior, manipulating attention and expectation to create a sense of impossibility. Each passenger's motive, greed, resentment, ambition, fear, was exploited to provide cover, yet none of it was the true engine of the crime. The orchestrator had anticipated reactions, and by studying those reactions, Poirot could reverse engineer the plan. The final piece clicked into place when he recalled an earlier, almost forgotten detail: the telegram itself. "It is not finished. You are the last passenger." The wording had seemed cryptic, but now he understood its dual purpose. Not only was it a threat to Sir Alister, but it also served to frame the killer as someone intimately connected to the passenger manifest, a person with knowledge of who would be aboard and who would be overlooked. The message, the whistle, the tampered plate, and the psychological responses were all parts of the same signature, left intentionally for an observer who knew what to look for. Poirot's sharp eyes then fell on Mrs. Cresswell, who had returned to her cabin after breakfast, her composure slightly frayed. Her repeated movements near the deck and the lounge the previous night, previously dismissed as wandering, now made sense. She had unwittingly confirmed the sequence of events in the killer's plan through her reactions and presence. And yet, she had not been the one to commit the act. She was, like many others, a pawn in a larger design, her personal grievances exploited to distract and mislead. With the pattern now clear, Poirot felt a surge of clarity. The orchestrator had relied on subtle provocations and psychological insight, exploiting minor behaviors and incidental details to hide the truth in plain sight. Every reaction, every tremor, every shadow, every object had been accounted for in the meticulous plan. And most importantly, the very things everyone else had overlooked: the thin sound of the whistle, the micro-expressions, the faint damp mark, were exactly what revealed the killer's method. Leaning back, Poirot allowed a faint smile. The chaos of the past night, the panic, the disappearance of Locke, and the vanishing Wisleal now followed a discernible pattern. The solution had been in plain sight all along, woven subtly into the actions and reactions of the passengers. It was a pattern of human behavior, deliberate and precise, and it was only a matter of moments before the final revelation would expose the orchestrator and bring the invisible hand of justice into view. Poirot spent the afternoon in quiet observation, walking the corridors of the ferry with the deliberate slowness of a man who saw everything yet revealed nothing. The passengers, still unsettled by the disappearance of Locke and the chaos of the morning, moved cautiously, as if the ship itself were a stage set for unseen dangers. Each step, each glance, each idle word from the crew or travelers fed into Poirot's meticulous calculations. He had discerned the pattern, traced the orchestration, and understood the web of misdirection, but the motive, the hidden impulse driving such calculated malevolence, remained elusive. It was in the lounge, when the fog outside thickened into a near-white haze, that a small observation crystallized into insight. Poirot noticed Mrs. Cresswell examining the deck rail with a distant expression, fingers drumming lightly against the varnish, her eyes tracing shapes in the mist. She muttered something under her breath, almost inaudible, yet enough to catch the detective's trained ear. He never deserved the end of it all. The words seemed mundane, even poetic, yet they resonated differently in light of the earlier events. Poirot considered them carefully. They reflected not only her personal grievance, but also an echo of something older, a long-suppressed injustice. He recalled the sequence of interactions. Denham's subtle flinch at the whistle, the telegram's cryptic phrasing, Barstow's fleeting anxiety, and Locke's role as witness rather than actor. Everything converged on a single point. The crime was not a matter of immediate gain or revenge in the conventional sense. It was orchestrated to satisfy a psychological imperative, a need to assert control and resolve a moral calculus in the mind of its author. The killer had designed the murder to be more than an act of violence. It was a statement, a reenactment of perceived slights and injustices from the past, each minor event in the passenger's reactions carefully manipulated to reinforce the illusion of omnipotence. Poirot's eyes fell on Denham again, who had been watching the lounge quietly, ostensibly indifferent. But now, the earlier observations fell into place. The damp cuff, the micro-expression at the whistle, his precise movements during the night. This was a man shaped not by anger alone, but by an obsessive need for recognition, for acknowledgement that he understood the moral debts owed and the hierarchies breached. He had orchestrated Sir Alister's death, not solely for personal revenge or financial advantage, but to impose a cosmic reckoning on someone whose presence had loomed over him, however indirectly, for years. The realization struck Poirot with the force of inevitability. The telegraphed warning, the manipulated objects, the disappearance of Lochiel were components of a psychological architecture designed to display mastery, to communicate silently that the orchestrator had anticipated every reaction, every flaw, every hesitation. It was the satisfaction of a long-held sense of moral superiority, expressed through acts that were meticulously planned, yet staged as chaotic. The criminal had wanted to prove, above all, that the world would bend to his understanding of justice, even if the cost was murder. Poirot rose slowly and addressed the small group of passengers lingering near the lounge. His voice was quiet but authoritative, carrying the weight of revelation. Mes amis, the crime we face is not one of ordinary motive. It is not merely greed, nor simple revenge, nor jealousy alone. It is the expression of a mind compelled to assert its own conception of right and wrong, to rectify, in its own terms, slights of the past. The murderer has acted to impose judgment, not simply to acquire or to punish, but to demonstrate mastery of consequence itself. Denham's eyes flickered, a slight blanch crossing his composed features. He realized, as Poirot's words landed, that the trap was closing. The careful camouflage of routine, the subtle manipulations, the psychological games all had been observed, dissected, and understood. For the first time, the orchestrator recognized that their hidden motive, their profound obsession with moral reckoning, had been laid bare. Poirot's gaze lingered. The crime had been planned with precision, yet no scheme, no matter how cunning, could escape the scrutiny of a mind trained to observe human behavior in its entirety. The hidden motive and obsession with justice, as a personal moral imperative, was the key, the engine, and the revelation that would ultimately unravel the entire web. And with that understanding, Poirot knew the final confrontation, long inevitable, could no longer be delayed. Poirot spent the remainder of the afternoon in silent preparation, each movement deliberate, each thought aligned with a strategy honed over decades. The fog outside the ferry had thickened into a ghostly curtain, isolating the ship from the world beyond, and turning the vessel into a closed stage, where observation and calculation could play their final act. He gathered the passengers in the lounge under the pretense of discussing morning's disturbances, yet every detail, the placement of chairs, the angle of light, the proximity to the cabin door, was orchestrated to provoke the subtle reactions he had been tracking. He began with a casual tone, recounting the chronology of events without accusation. As we know, Sir Alister Wrentham's demise was no ordinary incident. There were objects manipulated, steps calculated, and reactions predicted. His eyes swept the room, lingering just slightly longer on Charles Denham, who maintained his usual calm, though the faintest tension now betrayed itself in the tightening of his jaw and the careful positioning of his hands. Poirot continued, and yet the smallest signals, the most trivial of reactions, revealed truths which the cleverest deception cannot conceal. The detective picked up a small, ordinary object, a piece of paper from the telegram, folded carefully, and held it between his fingers, letting it catch the light. This message, simple in appearance, contained more than words. It was a signal, a provocation, a tool to stir the conscience of those involved. He allowed a brief pause, letting his gaze pierce Denham's composed facade. Some among us, I suspect, responded in ways they thought unnoticed. Yet no human behavior escapes the eyes of a trained observer. Denham's hand twitched, almost imperceptibly, toward the pocket where the whistle had vanished. Poirot noted it instantly. "Ah, yes," he murmured, as if to himself, the vanished whistle. A trivial object to most, but to those who understood its significance, a key to recognition and fear. He allowed the room to absorb his words. And so we arrive at the moment where truth must emerge, for deception cannot endure under light. Poirot stepped closer to Denham, voice steady but carrying a subtle gravity. "Monsieur Denham, the events of last night, the disappearance of Monsieur Locke, the manipulation of objects, and the reactions you sought to conceal all speak to a mind compelled by more than ordinary motive. It is not wealth, nor simple revenge, nor ambition that guided your hand. Nor it is a desire to impose moral reckoning, to assert justice upon Sir Alistair Wrentham as you perceived it." Denham's eyes flickered, a brief loss of composure betraying the controlled mask he had worn. The room grew silent, each passenger sensing the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Poirot's voice did not rise, yet it carried the weight of certainty. "You orchestrated every detail with precision, anticipating each response, each movement, each reaction. But the very things you believed concealed the small tremors, the flinches, the faint signals have revealed your mind, and with it, your intent." For a tense heartbeat, Denham said nothing, eyes darting toward the deck, toward the cabin, calculating escape. Then, finally, a faint sigh, almost a confession escaping before the mind could resist. "Yes," he admitted quietly, the first real crack in his demeanor. "Everything, it was to teach him a lesson. He never saw the consequences of his arrogance. I had to show him." Poirot inclined his head gently, not a triumph in his expression, but a quiet acknowledgment of understanding. "And now, Monsieur Denham, the lesson has ended, the consequences have been observed, and justice, in its truest sense, may finally rest upon those who must answer for their actions." Denham's shoulders slumped, the calculated mask gone, replaced by the weight of recognition that his meticulous orchestration, his attempt at moral vindication, could not evade observation. The passengers, witnessing the unmasking, felt a mix of relief and awe. The tension that had gripped the ferry since the first scream was finally beginning to release. Yet the gravity of the orchestrator's psychology, the lengths one mind could pursue in the name of personal justice, left an indelible impression. Poirot's gaze swept the lounge one final time. The trap had been laid, the pattern revealed, the hidden motive exposed. The final confrontation had succeeded not through force or intimidation, but through precision, observation, and the inexorable logic of human behavior. The orchestrator's hand had been unmasked, and at last the night's intricate web of deception and fear could begin to unravel, leaving truth and order restored aboard the ferry. Just as the tension in the lounge seemed to ease, a sudden commotion at the stern drew every eye. The fog, still thick and oppressive, concealed movement until a figure emerged from the shadows near the rail. Mrs. Lydia Cresswell, pale and trembling, clutching a crumpled envelope to her chest. She stumbled slightly before regaining composure, her voice quivering. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something... You must see this. I found it hidden under the lifeboat seat while looking for Mr. Locke." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he stepped toward her, his mind already turning over possibilities. The envelope was small, ordinary, yet its significance was immediately apparent. Any object discovered at this late stage, after the confession and apparent resolution, could not be dismissed. Mrs. Cresswell handed it to him, and with delicate fingers he opened it. Inside was a set of photographs and a handwritten note, each carefully arranged. The photographs depicted events from years prior, clandestine meetings, discreet exchanges of documents, and individuals in positions of influence, one of them previously suspected of wrongdoing. The note, written in a precise, elegant hand, read simply, "The game is not over. The hand that moves the pieces is not who you think." A chill ran down Poirot's spine, not from fear but from recognition. The confession of Charles Denham had been true but incomplete. Denham had orchestrated the immediate events, the murder and disappearance, in pursuit of his personal vendetta. Yet someone else had manipulated the broader circumstances, guiding him to act in a precise manner. The whistle, the telegram, even the placement of the passengers all had been subtly influenced by a hand invisible until now. Poirot turned his gaze slowly to the assembled passengers. Their faces, already etched with relief, now betrayed confusion and unease. Each person shifted slightly, subconsciously revealing more than words ever could. He noticed subtle signs: the angle of Mrs. Cresswell's gaze, the nervous tightening of Barstow's fingers around his cup, even the slightly too polite stance of Denham, as if he too felt the weight of something unseen. "The truth, mes amis," Poirot said quietly, voice measured, "is that crimes such as these are rarely the work of a single mind alone. Monsieur Denham acted out of grievance, yes, but someone has orchestrated the circumstances with a far wider understanding of human behavior, anticipating our every move, predicting our reactions, and even guiding the investigation itself." He allowed the pause to stretch, letting the words sink. The mastermind truly was hidden in plain sight, orchestrating events from behind the scenes, ensuring that each revelation, each misstep, and even our own confidence in Denham's guilt played precisely into their plan. The room was silent. Denham's composure faltered for the first time. His eyes flicked nervously toward Mrs. Cresswell, who avoided direct gaze, lips pressed tight. Poirot's sharp mind considered the possibilities. Who among them possessed the foresight, patience, and subtlety to manipulate both the killer and the investigators? He recalled the minor details he had initially dismissed: the small creases in Harper's notebook, the seemingly idle questions about passenger routines, the attentiveness with which Locke had noted the timing of each event. Each, until now, seemed incidental, yet in combination they painted a new picture. Poirot's mind raced, aligning patterns, reading the subtle cues of hesitation and intent. The mastermind's psychology was different from Denham's. It was colder, more calculated, and more patient. While Denham had been driven by a sense of personal justice, this other mind had orchestrated the environment itself, testing reactions, exploiting weaknesses, and setting the stage so that vengeance and morality intertwined in an almost theatrical tableau. He addressed the room once more, calm but firm. "The case is not yet closed. The hand that set this chain of events in motion is still at liberty, and we must identify them before the night concludes. The genius of the plan is formidable, yet as with all human designs, there are clues left for those capable of observation." Poirot's gaze lingered on each passenger in turn, measuring, calculating, waiting for the tiniest flicker, the smallest sign that would point to the unseen orchestrator. The final twist had arrived, and for the first time, the detective realized that the true challenge, the ultimate test of his little grey cells, was only just beginning. Poirot allowed the room to settle, his eyes quietly scanning each passenger as the fog outside thickened into a near-impenetrable curtain. He had now traced the faintest threads of the hidden hand, the manipulations that had guided Denham, the timing of events, the seemingly trivial actions that, in combination, formed a deliberate pattern. The envelope found by Mrs. Cresswell had been the key. Someone else had orchestrated the circumstances, controlling the stage while leaving the actors unaware of the full drama. He began slowly, his voice calm, precise, carrying the weight of inevitability. "Mes amis, the events of the night and this morning were not the work of a single mind. Monsieur Denham acted, as he confessed, from a sense of grievance and desire for retribution. Yet he was guided. The true architect of this chain of events has remained invisible, manipulating opportunities, timing, and even our attention." Poirot held up the photographs from the envelope. "These pictures, along with the note, reveal the mastermind's careful planning. Look closely, and you will see how each subtle instruction, each movement, each object, each whispered suggestion was designed to influence others without direct interference. The vanished whistle, the displaced brass plate, even the child's toy sandal were deliberately placed to provoke reactions that would reveal recognition, fear, or hesitation." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "And yet, as brilliant as this orchestration has been, even the most meticulous hand leaves traces. I observed them not by accident, but by noticing the patterns in human behavior, the contradictions in posture. The micro-expressions that betray thought before words can conceal it." His gaze fell on Elaine Harper, seated quietly in the corner, notebook in hand, her composure unnervingly steady. Poirot continued, "Miss Harper, you were clever, patient, and observant, yes, but also bold. You anticipated reactions, positioned events, and subtly guided Denham's actions without ever directly revealing your hand. That is why the pattern emerged only after the disappearance of Locke and the confession of Denham. You used the small, overlooked cue, the fog, the passenger's movements, the timing of your observations to maintain the illusion that control lay elsewhere. Elaine's face betrayed the first flicker of acknowledgement, a slight blanch, as if the net of observation had finally closed around her. Yet even now her posture was steady, measured, as if weighing a final, desperate choice. Poirot's eyes softened, not with indulgence but with recognition of the mind that had orchestrated so much. The brilliance of your plan is undeniable, yet it is precisely the subtle human sinusine inconsistencies, shifts in attention, hesitation before speech that reveal even the most careful hand. That is why justice, though delayed, cannot fail to observe the truth. The room was silent, each passenger now aware that the puzzle had been completed, the hidden motive exposed, the subtle manipulations traced. Denham, his initial arrogance dissipated, lowered his eyes in resignation. Harper remained quiet, her mind clearly calculating, yet Poirot's deductions had already mapped her influence. The orchestration had been masterful, but the detective's little grey cells were sharper still. Poirot stepped back, allowing the conclusion to settle naturally. Thus, we see that justice is not always immediate. Sometimes it is the patient observation, the careful reconstruction of events, and the recognition of subtle human signals that brings truth to light. Monsieur Denham will answer for the acts he committed, and Miss Harper, her influence cannot be ignored, though the law may not yet fully grasp it. The lesson, mes amis, is that human cunning can mislead, yet observation precise, patient, and thoughtful remains one step ahead. As the ferry continued through the fog, the passengers absorbed the weight of his words. Justice had been served, in part, yet the lingering awareness of unseen hands and subtle manipulations left an unsettling echo. The night's events were over, but the human mind, in all its brilliance and fallibility, had proven capable of both creation and concealment. Poirot's gaze swept the room one final time. The case was closed. Yet the memory of the hidden mastermind lingered, a reminder that in the world of crime, resolution is never absolute, and the pursuit of truth is a vigilance that must never waver. The fog had begun to lift as the ferry cut through the channel, leaving a pale, trembling light on the water that shimmered like silver beneath the engine's steady hum. Poirot stood near the railing for a moment, surveying the horizon and letting the weight of the case settle. The immediate danger had passed. Denham's actions had been accounted for, Harper's subtle orchestration recognized, and the passengers were returning cautiously to their cabins, still murmuring among themselves. Yet, for all the revelations and confessions, Poirot felt the familiar stir of unease, the sense that some threads had not been fully tied. Some shadow still lingered just beyond comprehension. He allowed his gaze to drift along the deck, noting small details that would escape the untrained eye. A stray glove lying near the lifeboat, faint scuff marks along the corridor leading to the cabins, and the soft imprint of footprints that ended abruptly near a maintenance hatch. Each by itself could be dismissed, yet together they whispered of movement that had gone unnoticed, an observer perhaps still watching, still part of the hidden drama. Poirot's little grey cells ticked with quiet satisfaction but also alertness. He had solved the crimes. Yes, but human ingenuity rarely reveals itself in totality, all at once. The telegram that had set the events in motion now lay folded neatly in his hand, the edges slightly crumpled but the words unchanged. "It is not finished. You are the last passenger." Poirot thought again of its cryptic phrasing. Denham had acted out of grievance. Harper had guided circumstances. Yet some unseen mind had placed the message where it could influence events without being directly implicated. Who had truly authored it? And what, if anything, had they intended beyond the chaos they had so carefully sown? He turned from the railing and walked slowly down the deck toward the lounge. The passengers were returning to their routines, a fragile veneer of normalcy settling over the ferry. Yet Poirot noticed subtle glances, slight pauses in conversation, as though each person carried a private unease they could not name. That unease, he knew, was often more telling than any confession or clue. Human behavior, once set in motion, leaves traces, sometimes faint, sometimes almost invisible but never truly gone. As he reached the lounge, Poirot paused near the edge of the staircase, glancing once more toward the upper deck, where the last disturbances had occurred. He allowed himself a small, wry smile. The case was, for now, resolved. The orchestrators identified, the crimes accounted for, but the faint anomalies remained. The abrupt ending of footprints, the glove left near the lifeboat, the precise choice of words in the telegram. Each was a reminder that the human mind could be far more complex than a single solution could ever fully contain. He adjusted his coat and began to descend into the lower deck, his steps light but purposeful. The passengers returned to their cabins, the ferry moving steadily forward, the engine's rhythmic thrum echoing through the hull. Yet Poirot's mind remained alert, quietly cataloguing the minor irregularities, the tiny inconsistencies, the whispers of human cunning that might yet prove significant. There was always one detail, one imperceptible action, one hidden motive waiting to reveal itself at the exact moment it would matter most. As he passed the lounge, his gaze briefly fell upon Mrs. Cresswell, who offered a faint, knowing nod gesture without words, yet heavy with implication. Poirot inclined his head slightly in return, acknowledging not only her part in the evening's events, but also the enduring complexity of human behavior. The night's mysteries had been resolved, but in the shadows remained questions unanswered, threads left unconnected, and a subtle reminder that the world of crime was never entirely closed. Stepping into the quiet of the lower deck, Poirot allowed himself a final thought. Justice may be served, but the mind that conceives a mystery is never truly satisfied. There is always another puzzle, another hidden pattern, another revelation waiting just beyond perception. And so, as the ferry pressed onward through the mist and the fading light, Poirot's little grey cells remained alert, ready for the next twist, the next challenge, because in the world of the detective, a mystery never truly ends.